Hi guys, and welcome to lesson one of Cool Enough to Code. Today we're going to be doing Hello World in Python. And today's focus is principally on some terminology as it relates to programming and how a programming environment works. I wanted to go through this to give you a primer on this because this will be fundamental knowledge for writing code in Python, not just Python, but pretty much any language in general. But this will serve you well as we move forward in these lessons. So we're going to be looking at what we call an integrated development environment and talking about some programming terminology and how you can use these tools to help you write code as we move forward in these lessons. There's a couple of key terms I want to introduce to you before we get too much into the weeds on this lesson. And these are the fundamental terms that we talk about when we talk about programming. And those would be the idea of an integrated development environment, or an IDE. An IDE is an app that you use to write code with. Now, if you think about an app, you might have some on a phone or a tablet or a computer. You might have Microsoft Excel for doing spreadsheets, or you might have a game that's an app that you use to play for fun, or maybe it's a social media app that you use to connect to social media to interact with your friends. An IDE is an app specially designed for writing code. And it has all the tools you need to write code with. So it has things like the ability to type code. It has the ability to check for problems in your code. It has the ability to offer assistance when you find problems with your code. So it gives you all these kinds of tools that are integrated into one app that you can use for writing code. Now, you use a IDE to actually do the art of programming or to write programs. Now, coding is a general term that encompasses pretty much all kinds of exercises when it comes to writing some kind of instructions that a computer can understand. A program is a set of those instructions that you use to create a desired task. So what we're going to be doing over the course of these lessons is writing programs that are that use code as part of those programs. So you might be writing a program that does something very basic like print hello world, and that's probably the most basic kind of program that you can have, or you can have a program that has multiple steps that does something more complex than a single line of code would do. All of them use code. Now, you might see the word program used interchangeably with app, and there might be some distinctions you can make between what is an app and what is a program. That's not our purpose here. It's just to understand that a program is a list of instructions that are all composed of the code that you put into that. And then when you take a program, that is the code you type, and then you turn it into something a computer can understand, that process is called compiling your code. So a program must go through this phase of compiling before a computer can understand it. So think of a program as a language that you can understand as a human, and the computer understands a different language. It's not the same one that you speak. And think of the compiler as a translator that takes your code, which is something you can understand, and translating it into something a computer can understand. And that process of doing that happens whenever you run your program. And that's how you can work with your program to see it actually executing the code, and then you can see the output from it. And that's how the computer understands, is by way of compiling it into that raw ones and zeros that a computer can read, while you're looking at something that looks more like English. Now we're looking at our IDE, and our IDE here is Tony. Now, Tony is an open source or free IDE that is designed for beginners to teach people how to code. And it comes on a Raspberry Pi, which I'm running here, or you can run it on Windows. A Raspberry Pi is a very basic computer. It's about 20 or 30 bucks, and you can plug a keyboard, mouse, and monitor into it, and you can learn to code on something that's fairly inexpensive. However, if you have a Windows box, you can use that as well. I'm connected to my Raspberry Pi remotely, but if I wanted to look at this Tony on my Windows box here's Tony running on Windows that allows me to have the same basic layout that we saw when we were looking at the screen from my Raspberry Pi. And so it's the same exact code, the exact same interface, with the buttons might be a little different and the fonts might be slightly different, but the functionality of this particular copy of Tony on Windows is the same as the functionality that we're going to see on my Raspberry Pi right here. So if you need a cheap computer, go out and get a Raspberry Pi, and you can plug a monitor and keyboard and mouse into it, and you will be up and running with this available. It actually comes pre-installed on a Raspberry Pi under Tony Python IDE. However, if you don't have it already installed on your Windows box, download it, install it. If you don't have it on your Mac box, download it and install it there as well. So let's take a brief tour of this IDE, this little app that we're going to be using for writing code in. Now, it's got the famous file menu that most apps on Windows might have, where you can open files and save files and those kinds of basic file operations that we're used to from a file menu. The edit menu, again, gives you the kind of things that you would come to expect from an edit menu: copy, paste, select all, undo, redo. These kinds of things are on the edit menu, and that's very useful when you're writing code, just like it is when you're writing text documents on a word processor. The view menu allows you to change things about the actual view. So if I want to increase the font size, for instance, I can increase the font size from the view menu. There's other kinds of things that you can view here as well. These are all the kinds of tools that are integrated in this particular IDE. We're not going to get into these tools today, and don't worry about them. We'll talk about many of these later on as we move through the lessons. Just know that they're here on the view menu, and we'll talk about some of these in future lessons. But for today, we're mostly going to be looking at this run menu, because this is the one that we use quite a bit whenever we're writing code, because this is where you can launch your code, your program from, or you can start debugging your program as well. And we'll talk about debugging in a minute, what that means. But here we have the ability to start our program and debug it as well. This device menu isn't really used much in IDE, but if you had external devices that you want to connect to whenever you're doing things like robotics, or you're doing device building or things like that, device menu would be where that would be. Tools is another important menu that we'll get into later on to future lessons, where we can have things like packages and things like that we can integrate with our programs that will extend the functionality of it. But again, we're not going to get into that today, but don't worry, we'll definitely be talking about this in future lessons. And of course, the help menu. And this is where you can get help content related to the IDE. And of course, the internet is full of related content to helping you learn how to code as well. But for our purposes today, we're mainly looking at this menu run right here, where I can actually start my program. So if I can also do it from this button right here as well. So this toolbar button right here, I can launch my program, or I can do it from this option right here, or I can press the F5 key on my keyboard. So let's just go ahead and launch this and run this little program. So you can see it does exactly what you would expect it to right here. You see print hello world, print hello world in Arabic, and print hello world in Thai. I don't speak Arabic. I have no idea how to say it, but in Thai you would say Sawadi Kau Lo, which is hello world in Thai. And this is hello world in English. And like I said, I don't speak Arabic, so maybe somebody can tell me how to say that in Arabic. All in all, it does exactly what we expect it to. And here are the results. Now, these are displayed down here in this thing called a shell. And a shell gets its name because it is a shell or a wrapper around your program. So a shell gives you the ability to put input into your program and also receive output from your program. So I can capture keyboard input from a shell, and then that will be put into my program. And then my program will have output by way of print commands or other commands, and that will be displayed inside of my shell. And the shell gets its name because it is a wrapper or a container around your program, in which gives you the ability to interact with it. So that's why it's called a shell. And with a shell, you can interact with it in other ways too, as shells are used widely in the Linux space as well as Windows space, and developers use them for a number of reasons. And one of them is working with the IDE that they're writing their programs in. So that's a brief tour of this particular IDE. Let's go back and look at some other terms that we will be using today, particularly related to debugging code. I want to introduce you to 5 new terms here that are related to programming as well. These have to do with the art of code itself. The first one is the idea of a function. Now, on the last screen, we saw an example of a function in the print word that we saw on the screen, and that print function had parentheses, and inside those parentheses, we saw some quotes surrounding some text. And that print function took the input in the form of the text and it performed a task, which was to write that text back to the shell. And that example of a function we called 3 times with 3 different kinds of text inside of that print function. So that's basically what a function does. And you can almost always identify that in Python when you see a word followed by some parentheses with some kind of data inside of that word. Now, the data that you pass into a function is called a parameter. And a parameter in the case of our print function was that text that we passed in as whether it was English, Arabic, or Thai. That was the parameter that the print function accepted. And the parameters can change, but the function can operate on any of those variations in the parameters that we pass into it. Now, a parameter can be what we call a hard-coded value, which is where I just type the text into the actual program itself, or we can pass in something called a variable. We'll look at variables more next week in our next lesson, but it gives you the ability to assign something to a value and pass that into a function. But for now, understand that a function can accept a hard-coded value like we saw, or it can accept a variable, and then it can perform the same basic operation on many different kinds of data that we pass into that particular function, which in that case we saw with the print function. We called the same function 3 times, but the parameter was different in each call with 3 different languages saying hello world. Now, syntax is the formatting of that particular language that we pass in, not the actual foreign language that we use as a parameter, but the actual programming language that we're using. So the syntax that we use in our function was the name of the function, the parentheses, then the parameter, then a closed parenthesis. And when we see that, we understand that it is a syntax that has to be met in order for the compiler to take that particular function and turn it into something that the computer can understand. If the syntax is not right, then the compiler doesn't know what to do with it, and you'll get something called a syntax error. For beginners, syntax errors are one of the biggest issues they run into, because when you're learning to code, you struggle with trying to understand how a particular language formats the actual language so that it can understand it by the compiler and turning that into code. And even something that's off by 1 character can cause a syntax error. Python is a really elegant language because it's got very simple syntax. And it's one of the main reasons that people who are learning how to code start with Python, because the syntax is so simple. You don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out syntax errors, and you can focus in more on learning how to code rather than trying to figure out if you're dealing with a syntax issue or you're dealing with some kind of issue. So let's go back over to Tony, and I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about syntax. I'm back here in Tony, and I have here on my screen my actual functions that I have right here. I have my print function that I'm calling 3 times, and I have the correct syntax here because when I run this, it's able to compile the code, and then it converts that code into something the computer can understand, and it puts it out there in my shell. So with this particular program, if I was to say remove a parenthesis and then try to run this, I'm going to get a syntax error here, and it's not going to compile it. So it's going to say syntax error, invalid syntax, because what it's trying to do is it's trying to interpret my intent here, because it doesn't see a close in parenthesis here. It's trying to go to the next line, then it sees this print command here as if it was a part of this one right here. And the computer doesn't know what to do with that. The compiler is confused at this point, so it says like, the compiler doesn't know how to handle that, and so it gives a syntax error. So to fix this, I simply can add my parenthesis back in, and then I can run this. So if you ever see a syntax error like that, you will know that it's something wrong with the formatting of your code, and that can be very frustrating for a lot of beginner developers, but with experience, you learn to recognize these things by looking at the code. And the great thing about Tony is it'll kind of give you some highlighted assistance here that it can help you to figure out what the problem with your particular program might be. And so it says here, an unbalanced parentheses, bracket, or braces, the open paren on line 1 is not closed by the end of the program. So it's looking for a closed bracket for closed parenthesis for this particular parenthesis right here. It doesn't find one. Notice if I click on one of these right here, it highlights it in blue. So that tells me that that one is closed. That means that pair is complete. I can do the same thing with this one. So if I close it up there, you can see that it finds the pair, and that helps me to do some syntax highlighting on my particular program right here. So syntax can be a very difficult thing to figure out for beginner programmers, but with experience, be patient with yourself and pay attention to what the IDE is trying to tell you, and that way you can figure out where your syntax issues are. You're gonna make those mistakes. I made literally hundreds of these when I started learning how to code, and they can be very frustrating. The great thing about Python is it's very simple syntax, so you don't have to worry a lot about these as much. Other languages, the syntax is a lot more verbose in terms of punctuation, using this one uses different things that we'll talk about in future videos, but understanding that the syntax for this is simple will help you be able to write code more focused on the actual problem solving of code and less worrying about syntax. The next two terms I want to talk about have to do with removing bugs in your program. Now, we talked about syntax errors, and a syntax error is a problem with the formatting of your code. But when you get your code to compile, that is, translating it from the human readable code that you're typing into something the machine can read and understand, it doesn't mean that your program is error free. It means that the syntax checks out and it will compile, but that doesn't mean that there isn't something about your program that is going to result in some kind of unexpected behavior. And that unexpected behavior is called a bug. And an IDE has a utility built into it called a debugger. And the process of removing those errors from your code is called debugging. And the debugger is a very handy tool, and you'll use the debugger throughout your duration of when you're writing code. I have worked with numerous IDEs going back almost 30 years now, and every single one of them had built into the IDE a debugger that allowed me to work through the code a line at a time so that I could see what was going on in the code as I worked through it. And that process is what we call debugging. Even experienced programmers make mistakes. You would think that with experience you make fewer of them. That's not always true. Sometimes you make mistakes because it's a very hard problem that you're trying to solve, or there are some edge cases that you didn't account for whenever you started writing your code. And even experienced developers that have been doing it for decades still use a debugger on a daily basis to figure out problems in their code. So it's probably going to be one of the most widely used features of your IDE. And the debugger works with something called breakpoints, which are the ability to set essentially a pause in your program. So when you start a program, you can start it at the top of your program and run it through to a breakpoint, and then the program will stop execution and will stop at a particular line of code, and then you can step through it because the breakpoint is there. When you have a program that might be hundreds or thousands of lines long, this becomes very useful, because if you just had to start your debugger and walk through every single line of code one line at a time to get to the line that you're wanting to work on, that could take a long time. So what you can do is skip past all of that and come to a breakpoint, pause on a particular line of code, and then zoom in on a particular section of your program, and then work through that particular section, having executed everything before that in just quick succession as you would expect it to run as if you just ran it normally. And so with breakpoints and a debugger, you can use these two tools to quickly figure out what's going on with your program and isolate the bugs, and then remove those bugs, and then get back to working code or a working state that you would desire your program to do. So let's go over to Tony and look at the debugger built into Tony and walk through the program using the tools that are available on the debug menu inside of that IDE. I'm back in Tony now, and I have my program here, and I don't have any breakpoints set. I don't have anything else on this. I cleared up my uh, shell down here, so there's no output. So if I was to click the run command, it's simply just going to run my program. So it's going to print hello world in 3 different languages right here. So if I wanted to debug this though, I wanted to show you what happens when I click the debug button. It's not going to just run through my program. It's going to start execution on the first line of code. It's going to pause it before it actually runs that line of code. It's not printed anything out down here. So I have 3 buttons that have ungrayed right here that I can use: step over, step into, and step out. We'll get into step into and step out when we talk about writing our own functions in a few weeks. But for now, let's focus in on the step over function, which is the one that'll allow me to step over each one of these lines of code. So if I click this one, it's going to execute this line of code and then pause on the next line of code. So if I click it again, it's going to go through the next line, and then finally it's going to call the last line of code, and then the program is finished running. And I can use this to start it again and do that exact same process. I can click the button here, I can use the run menu here, and I can work through it using this menu option, or I can press the F6 key that will allow me to step through it as well. Now, I prefer to use the F6 key just to debug and step over, because it's on the keyboard rather than have to use a mouse to do this. And I can press the F6 key, and it will step over each line of code as I walk through it. And as I get more into programming, you'll find that the keyboard is really more useful in a lot of common tasks, particular debugging tasks, whenever you're trying to really zoom in on a particular line of code. Now, everybody does it differently. I just prefer the keyboard. So I'm going to make this program a little bit longer. I'm just basically going to copy and paste this text a few times. So instead of 3 lines of code, I have 9 lines of code here. Now, a minute ago, I talked about a breakpoint. Now, a breakpoint I can set in my code if I want to run the program up to a particular point in my code. So let's set a breakpoint here on line 5. I do that by double clicking line 5 right here in this gray area right next to the print command. And that's going to put this red dot. To remove it, I just simply double click it again. And watch what happens if I click the debug button now. It's going to run the code up to line 5 rather than starting here on line 1 and then making me walk through that. So now it's paused on line 5, and I can start walking through that code and walking through it to the end of the program. And that's what a breakpoint allows me to do. So I can also set multiple breakpoints. Say if I set one here on line 2 and I set one here on line 6. And watch what happens when I run this now. It's going to come down here to line 2, and I can step through this like this, or I can press resume. And what resume is going to do is just simply jump down to my next breakpoint, which is on line 6. So I can have multiple breakpoints in a program that allow me to work through a particular line of code or a section of code, and then, okay, I'm done that. I can hit resume and then jump to my next breakpoint, and it will pause it on that particular breakpoint. And if I was to hit this button right here, I can hit stop, and that's just going to simply stop executing my debugger right in the middle of execution. So if I was running this particular debugger and something was going on, I couldn't figure out what's going on, I don't want to run this to the end of the program, I can quickly hit stop, or and that will stop the program right where it was on line 6 or 7, wherever it might be. And even with this form, even if I step through each line of code, say I went down to line 6, and I can keep going past it using the step over feature. Now, whenever you're doing debugging work, the ability to step through each line of code like this might not be so useful on a trivial program like this, but when we start to have things like variables, we start to have things like branching in our program, which we're going to talk about in future lessons, when we start to do things like loops and other types of programming structures that we're going to talk about in the future, the ability to step through your program becomes very useful, so you can see exactly what's going on inside of your programs. We'll be able to see things like variable values over here. We'll be able to see exactly how many times something's looping, the conditions of the loop, and so many other things that we'll talk about in future lessons. But getting used to using the debugger is going to be one of the most essential skills that you will have as a programmer. So understand this and understand it well, which brings me to our challenge. So let's go look at our challenge for this week. And I want you to practice using the debugger, and I'm going to encourage you to use the debugger in the challenge, and you'll see why in just a second. So for the challenge this week, I want you just to do a very basic program, basically what we did in the example that we saw inside of the IDE. I want you to create a Hello World program that writes Hello World in 4 different languages, not programming languages, but foreign languages. So like I had English, Thai, and Arabic, I want you to create a Hello World app that has Hello World in maybe Chinese, French, could be Korean, Japanese, whatever language that you want to use to say hello world in. And once you have that designed and you have 4 print commands with 4 different hello world, so you can tell what line you're on, set some breakpoints in your program and use the debugger in Tony or whatever IDE you're using to step through that particular program so that you can get used to setting breakpoints and stepping through the code so that you understand how the debugger works. And the reason I want you to work with the debugger is, as I've mentioned already, you're going to make mistakes in programming. So knowing how to use a debugger is going to help you solve those mistakes more quickly in your code. So once you have your code all debugged using the debugger and your syntax is correct and everything is working great, submit that to me on coolenoughToCode.com/feedback. And there's a form there that you can take your code, copy and paste it into that form. And I will look at your code and I'll send you some feedback. And if you so opt in, I will give you a shout out in next live stream saying that you successfully completed the challenge. So this week's challenge is pretty easy to do. I mostly just want you to get some experience working with the IDE, working with the debugger, and working with some basic syntax on how to make something work inside of that particular environment. So I hope to see you next week on next week's live stream. We'll be posting this particular video to YouTube. So if you, in case you missed it, you can check it out there, or if you want to review it. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me on the Cool Enough to Code website or any of the social media channels we have. You can reach out to me on YouTube, you can Twitter, you can also reach me on the website as well. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me on any one of those. And we'll be doing some more fun stuff with Python next week in lesson 2 on Cool Enough to Code. If you like this content, please consider liking this video, then clicking on the subscribe button to subscribe to our channel, then clicking on the bell notification icon and selecting all so that you'll get notifications when new content becomes available on our channel. You can also click on the share icon and share this video to any of your social media platforms. Sharing this helps make it more widely available for those who might be interested in coding. Also, consider following us on Twitter so you can see updates on Twitter whenever new content becomes available, as well as other announcements related to Cool Enough to Code. You can also help us out by becoming a patron on our page by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/coolenoughToCode and then clicking on Become a Patron. And there you can find out more information about how you can support our work with Cool Enough to Code. And like always, you can check us out online at coolenoughToCode.com. There you can find a schedule of all of the upcoming lessons that we have. You can also find out more information and reach out to us online here. And you can also watch the live stream as it comes out each week on coolenoughToCode.com as well. And like always, thanks for watching this lesson on Cool Enough to Code.